The galaxy is a vast ocean of stars, each light a whisper from ages past. Within it are empires, fleets, and legions whose histories are written in the dust of shattered worlds. The tale you are about to hear is one of steel and shadows, of walls built high and broken, of warriors forged in discipline and scarred by betrayal. Tonight, we drift toward the Iron Warriors, and the echo of their most bitter battle, known across the stars as the Iron Cage. The telling is slow and steady, like the march of an army across endless plains. You will not need to rush, for the pace of war in this story is not the strike of lightning, but the grinding turn of gears deep within a fortress heart. As the night folds around you, let the names and places drift in and out of focus. The iron within is not a battle cry here, but a murmur carried by the cold wind between the stars. To understand the Iron Warriors, you must first feel the weight of the worlds they built and the walls they broke. They were masters of siege, architects of destruction, and soldiers without rest. Born under the hand of their primarch, Perturabo, they served the Imperium with unmatched skill, yet always under a shadow of bitterness. His legion was not known for the glory of open field charges or the heroism of sudden victory. They were called when a foe would not yield, when a fortress refused to fall, when the price in lives would be counted in oceans of blood. In the great civil war known as the Horus Heresy, they chose rebellion, following their primarch into darkness. This choice set them on a path of endless war, hunted by those they once called brothers. The Iron Cage, their most infamous battle after the heresy, would bring them face to face with their greatest rivals, the Imperial Fists. It was a clash not just of weapons and armor, but of pride, memory, and vengeance. As you listen, imagine the sound of distant artillery, the feel of stone under your hands, the slow building of walls, and the waiting that never ends. The story will move from their earliest days, through the moments that forged their hatred, to the final locked struggle in the fortress trap. We will walk beside them in thought, without judgment, hearing the silence between each shot, until the last echo fades. In the far reaches of the galaxy, there is a world named Olympia, a place of mountains carved by storms and cities walled with stone. Its people were strong, but they lived in constant tension. Feuds between cities lasted for generations, and suspicion ran deep in every street. This was the world where Perturabo, the primarch of the Iron Warriors, came to maturity. It was not a gentle place, nor one of beauty without cost. Its valleys carried the echoes of marching feet, and its peaks bore the scars of countless fortifications. From an early age, Perturabo showed an understanding of machines and structures far beyond the reach of any other on the planet. While others sought power through words or swordplay, he found meaning in lines drawn on stone and in the silent weight of iron. The rulers of Olympia saw in him a way to strengthen their defenses. Under his guidance, walls rose higher, towers grew stronger, and the city-states began to feel invincible. This skill, though admired, also fed a quiet distance between him and those he served. His gaze was often on the horizon, not on the people around him. When the emperor found Perturabo, the meeting joined the destiny of Olympia with the wider Imperium. The Iron Warriors were formed from his gene sons, and they inherited both his talent for building and his patience for breaking down what others built. They were given the tasks no other legion wanted: Where other Space Marines might take a city in a day, the Iron Warriors might spend months under constant fire, digging trenches, building artillery emplacements, and slowly grinding the enemy down. In those long campaigns, they learned to see war as a problem to be solved, rather than a stage for glory. The early years of the Great Crusade saw the Iron Warriors fighting across countless worlds. They took pride in the strength of their formations and in the unshakable discipline that kept them moving even under the worst conditions. A fortress that had stood for centuries would fall under their guns. A defensive line thought unbreakable would crumble after their patient assault. Yet while their work won wars, it rarely won praise. The Emperor and his war council celebrated the dramatic victories of other legions, the ones achieved in open battle or by daring maneuvers. The Iron Warriors returned from their sieges with no cheers waiting for them, only another order and another long march. This quiet dismissal planted a seed in their hearts. Perturabo felt it most keenly. He saw himself as the unseen pillar holding up the Imperium's expansion, yet he was never invited to stand in the light. Over time, his vision of the Imperium shifted. The unity and honor he once believed in became shadows, replaced by a deep mistrust of those who received the rewards of his work. The Iron Warriors followed his mood, their pride turning inward. Their fortress walls grew higher in their hearts, closing off the warmth of brotherhood from other legions. Olympia, too, would play a darker role in his story. After decades of service to the Imperium, Perturabo returned to find his homeworld in rebellion. The same city-states he had once armed and strengthened now fought against imperial authority. He did not try to reason with them. Instead, he unleashed his legion on the world. The war was brief, but brutal, leaving Olympia's cities in ruins and its people in chains. Whatever love had remained between Perturabo and his birthplace was buried under the rubble. The act weighed heavily on the Iron Warriors as well, though they did not speak of it openly. It was a mark they carried into every war thereafter. The bitterness from these years would not fade. It colored every choice Perturabo made and every campaign the Iron Warriors fought. Though they still served the Imperium, the thought of loyalty began to feel hollow. They looked at their fellow legions and saw rivals, not brothers. They looked at the Imperium and saw a master who cared little for their sacrifices. The long sieges that once gave them purpose now felt like chains. In this shadowed state, the seeds of later betrayal took root. The Iron Warriors had not yet turned against the Emperor, but their hearts were already drifting away. Their Primarch's genius in war remained unmatched, yet it was no longer guided by faith in the cause. What began on the mountains of Olympia, with the building of walls and the sharpening of siegecraft, would one day end in a trap of their own making, one so deadly that even their greatest enemies would remember it for all time. The story of the Iron Warriors begins here, in the iron air of Olympia, in the mind of a Primarch who saw the galaxy as a puzzle of stone and steel. It is the first step toward the Iron Cage, though no one then could see the full shape of what was to come. The clang of hammers and the rumble of engines in those days were the heartbeat of a legion that would one day break its chains, even if it meant shattering itself in the process. The Great Crusade was a vast wave of conquest, washing over the galaxy with the strength of countless legions. Each Primarch led his sons in ways that reflected his own nature. Some thrived in the speed of open battle, striking fast and claiming worlds in a rush of banners and fire. Others preferred complex strategies that unfolded over time. Perturabo's place in this great war was always clear. His campaigns were never sudden bursts of victory. They were calculated, patient, and relentless, like the slow tightening of a great steel vise. It was in these long wars that the Iron Warriors earned their reputation. They built vast siege lines, layered with gun positions and trenches stretching for miles. Every move was measured, every strike designed to break down the enemy's will as much as their walls. When they approached a fortress, they did not rush. They surrounded it, cut off its lifelines, and wore it down until surrender was the only choice. It was a style of war that demanded endurance and absolute control, and it suited them perfectly. Yet this mastery also drew the attention of Rogel Dawn and the Imperial Fists. Dawn, like Perturabo, was a master of fortifications, but his vision was turned inward toward building defenses for the Imperium itself. He saw beauty and pride in walls that stood against all enemies. Perturabo, on the other hand, saw beauty in finding the flaw in any wall and bringing it down. The two philosophies could not be more opposed. In one, the fortress was the symbol of security and unity. In the other, it was a challenge to be answered and defeated. At first, their rivalry was quiet. Each knew the other's skill and perhaps respected it, though the respect was edged with caution. Over time, small comparisons began to surface. Who could design the stronger wall? Who could break it faster? Who could adapt quicker to an unexpected weakness? Such questions might have stayed as professional challenges, but in the age of the crusade, pride was as sharp as any blade. The Emperor himself placed Dawn at the center of the Imperial defenses, giving him charge over the construction of the palace on Terra. This was the kind of honor Perturabo had always wanted, a recognition of his genius. Instead, it was given to the one man whose methods and ideals clashed with his own. This decision cut deep. To Perturabo, it was proof that his work was valued only when it served others, never celebrated on its own. The Iron Warriors continued their campaigns, but an undercurrent of resentment grew stronger. Every victory felt less like a triumph and more like the meeting of an expectation no one would praise. The rivalry with Dawn became more than a matter of skill. It became personal, a silent contest fought across the stars, in every report of a fortress built or a fortress taken. For the men of the Iron Warriors, this tension filtered down into their own sense of identity. They knew they could break any stronghold, yet they also knew that their deeds would never be set in the same light as the victories of other legions. The image of the Imperial Fists guarding Terra's walls became a reminder that no matter how many sieges they won, their place in the Imperium was set apart. They were the tools of destruction, not the guardians of the realm. The truth is that rivalry in the Imperium was as much about perception as it was about results. To many, Dawn's stoic defense fit the ideal of the Emperor's vision. Perturabo's relentless dismantling of enemy worlds, though necessary, carried the mark of ruin. In the eyes of history, one would be remembered as a shield, the other as a hammer. Such comparisons are dangerous, for they shape not only how others see you, but how you see yourself. The more the rivalry grew, the more it took root in Perturabo's thinking. Each fortress conquered by the Iron Warriors seemed to whisper a question about whether the walls of Terra itself could be broken. Each campaign reinforced his belief that he could do what others believed impossible. Whether it was a matter of pride, bitterness, or a hunger for recognition, that thought would never leave him. It would sit in the quiet corners of his mind, waiting for a moment when such a challenge might be more than a dream. This chapter of their history is not marked by open conflict between the two legions. It is instead a slow building of tension, brick by brick, as each victory and each slight piled higher. Rivalries of this kind rarely burn bright at first. They smolder, waiting for the right fuel. The day would come when that fuel would arrive, and the fire it lit would burn through the hearts of both legions. For now, the Great Crusade pressed on. The Iron Warriors continued to claim worlds in the Emperor's name, and the Imperial fists continued to build his defenses. From a distance, their paths seemed parallel, but beneath the surface, the lines of their destinies were beginning to curve toward one another. In time, they would meet, not as brothers, but as enemies locked in a contest where pride, skill, and fury would decide the fate of thousands. The march toward that moment was steady and unstoppable. Every wall built by the fists and every wall broken by the Iron Warriors was another step closer. This is how rivalries in the Imperium ripen into wars. They are not born in the heat of a single battle, but in the long shadows cast by many. Soon, the shadows would deepen, and the galaxy would see just how far two masters of stone and steel could fall when their visions collided. The Horus Heresy began as a fracture hidden beneath the armor of the Imperium. What started with whispers and secret oaths soon became a wound that would bleed across the galaxy. Horus, once the favored son of the Emperor, turned against the throne and brought with him half of the legions. Perturabo and the Iron Warriors were among those who chose his side, a decision that was not made in haste but shaped by years of growing resentment. For Perturabo, it was a chance to strike at an Imperium that had taken his loyalty for granted and to stand against Dawn without restraint. When the call came to muster for war, the Iron Warriors did not hesitate. Their first great act in the service of Horus was to take part in the infamous drop site massacre on the world of Istvan Vith. Loyalist legions had been sent there to crush Horus's rebellion quickly. They believed they were walking into a final battle that would restore unity. Instead, they stepped into a killing ground prepared with cold precision. The Iron Warriors played their part with the same discipline they had shown in every siege, only now the target was their former brothers. The trap closed when the traitor legions turned their guns on those who had fought beside them moments earlier. The battlefields of Istvan became a sea of fire and broken armor. Loyalists who had trusted in the strength of the Imperium were cut down under barrages they could not answer. In those moments, the Iron Warriors showed no hesitation. Years of bitterness, long campaigns without praise, and the shadow of their Primarch's grudges all came to the surface. The discipline that had once served the Imperium now served the work of betrayal. Istvan was more than a victory for the traitor legions. It was a breaking point for the galaxy. The shock of it spread far beyond the battlefield, shattering trust and forcing every legion to choose a side. For the Iron Warriors, there was no turning back. They had crossed a line that would forever define them. Their reputation as masters of siege was now bound to the memory of treachery, and whatever cause they claimed to fight for, the blood of Istvan marked their name. In the years that followed, Perturabo drove his legion deeper into the war against the Emperor. They tore through worlds with the same patient force they had once used to expand the Imperium. The skills that had made them indispensable in the Great Crusade were now weapons against it. Cities that resisted Horus fell under their guns, and fortresses that dared to hold out were reduced to rubble. The Iron Warriors no longer fought for recognition or favor. They fought to bring low the empire that had, in their eyes, betrayed them first. The fall of Olympia had already hardened Perturabo's heart, but the heresy sharpened it into something unyielding. He showed no mercy to those who opposed him, and his sons followed his example. The bond with their former brothers was gone, replaced by a cold certainty that the only safety lay in the strength of their own walls and the destruction of those who stood outside them. This was not a sudden transformation, but the end of a long road that had begun with overlooked victories and quiet rivalries. From a distance, it is easy to see how events like Istvan were inevitable once the seeds of resentment were planted. The Imperium relied on the loyalty of men who were also driven by pride, ambition, and the desire to be seen. When these were denied long enough, they could twist into something far more dangerous than open rebellion. Perturabo's choice to side with Horus was not just a matter of politics or strategy. It was the expression of a belief that the Imperium no longer deserved his service. By the time the heresy neared its climax, the Iron Warriors had become a legion apart. They were bound neither by love for the Imperium, nor by the oaths they had once sworn to its emperor. Their loyalty was to their Primarch, and to the idea that no wall, no matter how strong, could stand forever. This philosophy would carry them to some of the most infamous sieges of the war, and it would also guide them toward the confrontation with the Imperial fists that would define their legacy. The story moves from Istvan toward the final battles of the heresy, but the shadow of that massacre stretches far. Every move the Iron Warriors made after it carried the weight of what they had done there. In their eyes, the betrayal had been necessary, even inevitable. To the Imperium, it was the act that erased any claim they had to honor. Between these two views lay a gulf that would never be crossed. And in that gulf, the foundations for the Iron Cage were already being laid. The end of the Horus Heresy was not a clean break between victory and defeat. It was a slow scattering, like ash carried by a restless wind. Terror had been held. Horus was gone, and the traitor legions were forced to flee into the dark places of the galaxy. For the Iron Warriors, this retreat did not mean surrender. It was the start of a new kind of war, fought from the shadows of the Eye of Terror, where the broken legions found refuge. The Iron Warriors left behind the burned worlds of the heresy and withdrew to their own strongholds. They no longer fought for the Imperium's vision, and they no longer fought for Horus either. Their loyalty narrowed until it was fixed only on Perturabo and the survival of their own legion. In the Eye of Terror, they began to build again, though what they built now was not for defense alone. They created vast fortress worlds, each one layered with the traps, artillery lines, and hidden paths that had always been their hallmark. These strongholds were not symbols of hope or protection. They were engines of war, designed to launch raids into Imperial space and to stand unbroken against any who dared to follow them into the Eye. The galaxy beyond was still reeling from the war, and in that confusion, the Iron Warriors carved out an empire of their own. They gathered slaves and resources from conquered worlds, forcing entire populations to labor under their command. The construction never stopped. Walls rose, minefields spread, and orbital guns were placed in rings of steel around their holdings. In this environment, the Legion adapted to its exile. Siegecraft was no longer just a tool of conquest. It was the framework for survival in a realm where chaos warped the laws of reality. Perturabo himself changed in these years. His bitterness had been forged into something harder, a kind of cold precision that no longer sought approval from anyone beyond his own command. The grudges that had shaped him during the crusade were not forgotten. The memory of Dawn and the Imperial fists was never far from his mind. The rivalry that had once been confined to pride and recognition had become a personal wound, one he intended to answer when the chance came. The Iron Warriors did not see themselves as defeated. In their view, the war had simply shifted to a different battlefield. They had lost the open roads of the Imperium, but they had gained the safety of the Eye, where their enemies could not reach them without great cost. From this position, they struck at Imperial supply lines, fortified worlds, and even at rival traitor warlords. Every campaign was approached with the same methodical patience they had always used. The Iron Within had become not just a rallying call, but a way of life. Still, the isolation took its toll. The constant pressure of chaos and the endless preparation for war hardened them in ways that went beyond discipline. They trusted no one outside their own ranks, and even within the Legion, strength and skill were the only measures of worth. The walls they had once built to contain enemies now seemed to rise around their own hearts. This was a legion that had been shaped by siege, and in exile, it began to resemble the very fortresses it created. Strong, unyielding, but always under strain from within. Over time, whispers spread across the Imperium about the Iron Warriors' growing power in the Eye. Imperial commanders knew that to cross into their territory was to face a gauntlet of guns and traps, unlike anything else in the galaxy. To the outside, these fortresses were a sign that the Iron Warriors were entrenched and waiting. To Perturabo, they were only the foundation for something greater. The rivalry with the Imperial Fists had not faded in the years after the heresy. If anything, the distance and silence had made it sharper. Dawn's defense of Terra had stood in contrast to Perturabo's failure to take it. That memory lingered like a challenge unanswered. For a man who had built his life on breaking walls, leaving such a fortress untouched, was a scar that no amount of conquest could erase. The stage for the Iron Cage was already set, though no one outside the Legion could see its shape. In the quiet of their fortress worlds, the Iron Warriors were preparing more than defenses. They were crafting the kind of trap that would not just defeat an enemy, but humiliate them. The design was not rushed. It would take years of thought, resources, and patience to bring it to life. For Perturabo, it was not simply about winning a battle. It was about settling a score that had been building since the first walls were raised on Terra. From the scattered remains of a civil war, the Iron Warriors had built an empire of steel in the heart of chaos. They had become something both familiar and changed. The skills they had used in service to the Imperium were now turned fully against it. Their fate was fractured, but their purpose was sharper than ever. Every stone they placed and every gun they mounted was part of a plan that would one day draw their oldest enemies into the deadliest of traps. The next part of the story will lead into that moment, where the patience of decades would meet the pride of 2 legions. The Iron Cage was not born from sudden rage. It was built over years, in the same slow, deliberate way the Iron Warriors had always fought. Soon the walls would rise, and the trap would close. In the cold reaches beyond Imperial borders, a world of rock and steel took shape under the eyes of Perturabo. This place, Sebastus IV, was not chosen for its beauty or resources. It was chosen because it could be reshaped into a weapon that no fleet could ignore. Over years, the Iron Warriors transformed its surface into a labyrinth of defenses. Fortifications stretched across continents. Gun batteries ringed its horizons. Beneath the ground, hidden tunnels and bunkers twisted into patterns that only the Iron Warriors could understand. The fortress at the heart of this world was no simple bastion. It was built as a challenge, as much to draw an enemy in as to keep them out. Its walls were layered with kill zones, each one designed to break attackers slowly. Any who advanced would face mines buried deep in the soil, hidden artillery nests, and choke points that forced armies into narrow channels under constant fire. The deeper one pushed, the deadlier the path became. Perturabo called it the Eternal Fortress. To the Iron Warriors, it was a perfect expression of their craft. To the Imperial Fists, it would become a lure. Years had passed since the Horus Heresy, but the rivalry between Perturabo and Rogel Dawn had not dimmed. For Perturabo, the defense of Terra was still a wound left open. Dawn's role in holding the palace during the siege was a victory that had eclipsed the Iron Warrior's own efforts. That memory lingered, hardening into a personal vow that one day he would force Dawn into a battle where his skill at defense would be turned against him. Sebastus IV was built for that purpose. From orbit, the planet looked like a scarred shell, its surface divided by deep trenches and long ridges crowned with steel. But what could be seen from above was only a fraction of its danger. The true strength of the Eternal Fortress was buried far beneath, where layers of reinforced chambers and armored passageways led attackers into carefully planned traps. The design was not about stopping an enemy at the walls. It was about letting them believe they could breach them, drawing them further inside until retreat became impossible. The construction of Sebastus IV was a work of obsession. Every angle, every sight line, every overlapping field of fire was calculated. The Iron Warriors poured their skill into it with the same dedication they once gave to the Imperium's wars. The difference now was that this work had no master beyond Perturabo himself. There was no wider cause to serve. The Eternal Fortress existed for one purpose only: to answer the rivalry that had haunted the Iron Warriors for decades. In the Imperium, news of the fortress spread slowly. Reports filtered through of a heavily fortified world deep in enemy territory, guarded by the Iron Warriors with unusual intensity. For most Imperial commanders, such a place was just another threat to be avoided or destroyed from a distance. But for Dawn, the thought of the Iron Warriors holding such a fortress carried a weight beyond strategy. The rivalry between the two legions was no secret, and for the defenders of the Imperium, the existence of the Eternal Fortress felt like a direct challenge. The decision to confront the Iron Warriors on Sebastus IV would not be taken lightly. Attacking a fortress built by Perturabo was unlike any other campaign. The Imperial fists had spent their history perfecting the art of defense, but here they would be forced into the role of attackers. Every instinct they had honed, every lesson from the walls of Terra, would be tested in a battlefield designed to twist those strengths into weaknesses. From the Iron Warriors' side, this was the desired outcome. The fortress was never meant to stand untouched. It was meant to be attacked, to draw the Imperial fists into a contest that would decide which legion truly mastered the art of war between walls. For Perturabo, the chance to break Dawn's warriors in a siege was worth any cost. For the Iron Warriors, it was the opportunity to prove that their skill at dismantling fortifications was matched by their ability to build traps that no enemy could escape. As the final sections of the fortress were completed, the world seemed to take on a life of its own. Patrols moved constantly across its surface. Defensive drills were carried out in silence, each soldier knowing their place in the greater design. The air was thick with the sound of machinery and the distant thump of artillery tests. From the outermost defenses to the deepest underground vaults, the Eternal Fortress was ready. The galaxy is filled with fortifications, but few are remembered in history. Most stand only until they are bypassed or destroyed. The Eternal Fortress would be remembered not because it was unassailable, but because it was built to be taken. And in taking it, the attackers would destroy themselves. That was the genius of the design, and it was a lesson that would be taught in blood. From this point, the path to the iron cage was inevitable. The trap had been set, the lure prepared, and the rival Dawn was certain to come. The stage was no longer the shifting battlefields of the heresy, but a single fixed arena where the skills and pride of two legions would collide. The slow work of years was done. Now the Iron Warriors waited for the first step of their enemy onto the killing ground. When the Imperial Fists committed to the assault on Sebastus IV, the choice was more than a matter of strategy. The Eternal Fortress was not just another enemy position to dismantle. It was the creation of their oldest rival, a challenge placed deliberately in their path. The march toward it carried a weight that went beyond the normal rhythm of a campaign. Every step across the cold ground felt like the approach to a final proving ground, where pride, skill, and years of history would be measured. The approach began with an orbital deployment. From the void above, the fortress seemed smaller than the legend that surrounded it. The scars across its surface were visible even from high orbit, trenches cutting through the earth like veins of shadow, ridges bristling with gun emplacements, and the faint glint of steel towers marking lines of defense. The Imperial Fists prepared their descent with the discipline that had defined them for centuries. They were not reckless in their movements, but they carried the certainty of warriors who believed no wall could stand before their will. Once the landings began, the scale of the challenge became clear. The ground itself seemed to resist their progress. The first positions they seized were already under precise fire from batteries hidden far beyond visual range. Shells struck in patterns that suggested the enemy knew exactly where they would deploy. The terrain funneled their advance, forcing them into narrow lines where cover was scarce and visibility for defenders was perfect. Missile silos hidden beneath the surface came to life as the attackers pushed forward. These were not aimed to destroy the Fists outright, but to break their formations, to scatter units so that they could not bring their full strength to bear. Each explosion reshaped the battlefield, sending debris and choking dust into the air. Communications grew patchy as interference from deep-set transmitters disrupted their signals. Every step forward was answered by a response from the defenders, as though the fortress itself was alive and adapting. In this kind of battle, momentum could not be maintained in the way the Fists were used to. The long march toward the central fortress slowed until it became a grinding push measured in yards. Positions had to be seized again and again as counterattacks struck from concealed tunnels and breach points that seemed to appear where none had been before. Each capture revealed another layer of defenses waiting just ahead, each one designed to keep the attackers under constant strain. For the Iron Warriors, this was exactly the fight they had designed. The Eternal Fortress did not seek to throw back its attackers in a single decisive blow. It aimed to wear them down, to make the act of advancing feel like a slow drowning. The Imperial Fists had to commit more men, more ammunition, and more time than they had planned for every gain. The deeper they moved, the more resources the fortress demanded. The rhythm of the advance became predictable in its exhaustion. Days of heavy fighting would be followed by nights of tense rebuilding, where defensive positions had to be reinforced before the next push. Supply lines grew longer and more exposed, targeted by artillery fire from guns placed at impossible distances. Even the weather seemed to work against them, with the cold seeping into armor joints and slowing every movement. From a strategic view, the Imperial Fists still held the advantage in discipline and cohesion. They were advancing, slowly but surely, and their siege-breaking skills were formidable. Yet the cost was already beginning to mount. Every casualty was a reminder that the Iron Warriors' design was working. The trap was not to hold the fortress forever, but to make the taking of it bleed the attackers until the victory would feel hollow. The closer they drew to the inner lines, the clearer it became that the Imperial Fists were being drawn toward a decisive point, one chosen by Perturabo long before the first shot was fired. The killing fields ahead were arranged so that there would be no room to withdraw without abandoning the wounded and the hard-won ground behind them. It was a design that preyed on the attacking legion's sense of honor as much as its military strength. Every mile gained was a deeper step into a place where retreat would mean defeat in more than just military terms. The Iron Warriors understood their enemy well enough to build the battlefield around that truth. The march had become not just a physical journey into enemy territory, but a tightening of the psychological trap. The fists would press on, because stopping was not an option they could accept. By the time the outer works of the Eternal Fortress were in sight, the Imperial fists had already paid heavily in lives and material. Still they moved forward, not knowing how much deeper the trap reached beneath their feet. The surface war was only the first act, and the design of Sebastus IV promised that the worst would not be seen until it was far too late to turn back. The lines were drawn. The defenders had given ground with care, always enough to keep the attackers pressing in, never enough to let them claim a true victory. Ahead lay the inner fortress, where the plan would be revealed in full. The next steps would take the fists out of the open trenches and into the narrow channels where the Iron Warriors could bring their full strength to bear. The descent into the trap was nearly complete. By the time the Imperial fists reached the inner defences of Sebastus IV, the ground had changed from rough ridges to a maze of trenches and earthworks. These were not hastily dug lines meant to delay an advance. They were permanent features reinforced with steel and concrete, shaped to control every movement an attacker might make. From above, they formed interlocking patterns that made retreat and advance equally difficult. Each trench was part of a network designed to funnel soldiers deeper into kill zones, without them realizing it until it was too late. The air inside the trenches was heavy with smoke and dust. Artillery fire landed in steady rhythms, not so much to destroy the attackers outright, but to keep them pinned and disoriented. Every time the Imperial fists tried to regroup for a push forward, another layer of defenses would open fire. The ground under their boots shook as mines detonated beneath carefully chosen sections of earth. Even when the enemy could not be seen, the sense of being surrounded was constant. Progress here was slower than anywhere else in the campaign. Each trench line taken revealed another only a short distance ahead. Some were empty, abandoned by the defenders to draw the attackers in. Others were heavily manned, forcing brutal close combat where space was too tight for heavy weapons. The deeper the fists pushed, the more they were cut off from their supporting units, until many groups found themselves fighting alone in narrow corridors with no clear sense of direction. In these conditions, the advantage shifted sharply toward the Iron Warriors. The defenders had prepared for every angle of attack. They knew which lines to abandon and which to hold, which positions to sacrifice in order to lure the enemy into a dead end where overlapping fields of fire could tear them apart. Even when the Imperial fists broke through a section, they would find themselves under attack from hidden side tunnels, their flanks exposed to gunfire from positions they could not reach without pulling back. The psychological strain began to build. In the open, the fists had been able to see their objectives and measure their progress. Here, surrounded by walls of dirt and steel, the horizon was gone. The only markers of advance were the number of trenches behind them, and the growing sense that the fortress was swallowing them whole. Every foot gained was paid for in casualties, and every casualty meant fewer hands to hold the ground they had taken. Supplies were becoming harder to move forward. Ammunition had to be carried by hand along narrow routes under constant fire. Medical aid was delayed by the difficulty of moving the wounded out of the trenches without exposing them to enemy guns. The defenders had made the land itself part of their weapon, ensuring that even survival required more effort than most armies could endure for long. Still, the Imperial fists pressed on. Their training and discipline kept them moving even when the path forward seemed hopeless. But here, hope was a fragile thing. Every push forward ended with another trench to cross, another set of barricades to break, another round of hidden guns waiting to fire. The defenders had no need to rush the fight. Time was on their side, and the longer the attackers stayed in the trenches, the more the trap closed around them. It is here that the true nature of the Eternal Fortress became clear. It was not built to repel an attack from the outside. It was built to absorb it, to pull the enemy deeper while cutting away at their strength piece by piece. The Imperial fists were still advancing, but each step forward was costing them more than the last. Even victories began to feel like losses when the ground gained could not be held without new sacrifices. For the Iron Warriors, this was the perfection of their craft. Every trench, every hidden firing point, every minefield was part of a larger plan that did not need to win in a single moment. The aim was to break the attacker's ability to continue, to make the fight itself the weapon. And as the days wore on, the strain began to show in the slowing pace of the advance and the growing number of empty places in the ranks. By the time the Imperial fists reached the deepest lines of the trench network, their numbers had been thinned and their resources stretched to the limit. Yet still they pushed forward, driven by the belief that if they could reach the inner fortress, the battle could be decided. What they did not see was that this belief was part of the design. The fortress was still waiting for them, and the worst of the trap had yet to spring. The deepest lines of the Eternal Fortress marked the place where the Imperial fists were meant to break. By now, the battle had gone beyond the point of a straightforward siege. The trenches behind them were choked with the dead and the wounded. The ground they had crossed was littered with shattered armor and abandoned weapons. Each section taken had left them weaker, and every defense they faced had been stronger than the one before. Inside the fortress walls, the Iron Warriors kept the pressure constant. The guns never fell silent for long, and the trenches they had abandoned earlier in the battle were sometimes retaken in sudden strikes, cutting into the Imperial fists' supply lines. The attackers were forced to fight both forward and backward, never able to rest in one position without the threat of being surrounded. This constant motion drained their strength faster than the heaviest bombardment could have done. The final push toward the fortress's core was the most costly. The killing fields before the inner gates were wide and exposed, with little cover to shield the attackers from the weapons mounted on the walls. Every approach had been calculated so that advancing soldiers would be caught in crossfire. Mines were hidden in open stretches, forcing attackers into predictable routes that could be targeted with deadly precision. Even when the Imperial fists managed to reach the outer face of the core fortress, they found themselves fighting for footholds under relentless fire. The Iron Warriors knew the ground as if it were part of their own armor. They had built every step of it and knew exactly when and where to strike. The attackers' numbers had fallen so low that holding any gain was nearly impossible without immediate reinforcement, and reinforcements were slow to arrive through the maze of contested trenches. The cost in lives had reached the point where the assault could no longer be sustained without outside help. That help came in the form of the Ultramarines, arriving in force to break the deadlock. Their arrival was not part of the Iron Warriors' plan, and it turned the trap into a contest they could no longer control. The additional forces pushed into the fight, relieving some of the pressure on the Imperial fists and forcing the Iron Warriors to defend multiple points at once. The sudden shift in numbers began to strain the Iron Warriors' control over the battlefield. Positions that had held firm for weeks began to fall in rapid order as the Ultramarines' organized advance cut through secondary defenses. For all their preparation, the Iron Warriors could not be everywhere at once. The fortress's outer ring, once a slow grinder of advancing forces, became a series of contested pockets. In some places, the defenders were able to hold, but in others they had to fall back or risk being surrounded. The Imperial fists, reinforced and rearmed, threw themselves back into the fight with renewed force. They advanced not as scattered units, but in coordinated blocks that cleared trench lines methodically. The added firepower from the Ultramarines' artillery allowed them to silence batteries that had dominated the battlefield since the first day of the assault. The siege was turning, but every gain was still costly. The Iron Warriors made them fight for every position, and many of those positions were left so damaged by the struggle that they could not be held without further work. Inside the Eternal Fortress, Perturabo's designs still held value. Withdrawal was not a matter of simply running from the field. It was deliberate, carried out in stages, and each stage inflicted new casualties on the attackers. As the Iron Warriors abandoned outer sections, they detonated charges that collapsed tunnels and buried artillery pieces in rubble. They flooded some trenches and set fire to supply depots, ensuring that the enemy would gain nothing of use from their advance. The Ultramarines and Imperial Fists eventually broke into the inner works, where the fighting became even more brutal. The corridors were narrow, designed to deny attackers room for large formations. Every corner could hide a gunner, every doorway a trap. Even in retreat, the Iron Warriors forced their enemies to bleed for each yard of ground. The defenders used the same tunnels to slip behind advancing units, striking at them from the rear before vanishing into the maze again. The fight for the fortress's heart stretched into days of constant pressure. By now the attackers had to contend with exhaustion as much as enemy resistance. The air inside the fort reeked of smoke, oil, and blood. Water was scarce, and the wounded had to be carried long distances to reach any safe area. Still, the attackers pushed forward, driven by the need to finally end the battle and bring down the Iron Warriors' trap. In the end, it was not a single decisive strike that broke the defenders, but the cumulative effect of constant pressure from two legions. The Iron Warriors saw that the field could no longer be held without risking total encirclement. They began their final withdrawal, pulling back into pre-prepared routes that led away from the fortress and deeper into territory they still controlled. These routes were mined and trapped, covering their retreat and further slowing the pursuit. When the guns finally fell silent, the ground around Sebastus IV was unrecognizable. Trenches that had been fought over again and again were filled with the debris of war. Craters marked where artillery had landed with such force that the soil itself seemed burned. The casualty lists for the Imperial Fists numbered in the hundreds, and many of those who lived carried wounds that would never fully heal. The Ultramarines' intervention had prevented the complete destruction of the Imperial Fists, but it had also ensured that the Iron Warriors were able to withdraw with much of their strength intact. In the wider view of the war, the battle had no decisive winner. The fortress still stood in part, though it was scarred and broken in places. The Imperial Fists had survived, but at a cost that would shape their future. For the Iron Warriors, the outcome was a statement. They had faced their greatest rivals on ground of their own making, and left them bloodied beyond any other battle since the Heresy. In the years after the Iron Cage, the Imperial Fists would rebuild, but the memory of Sebastus IV remained. The losses were so great that their legion was reorganized into smaller chapters, scattering their strength across the galaxy. For the Iron Warriors, the battle became proof of their mastery over siegecraft and the depth of their resolve. They had set the trap, held it as long as needed, and left on their own terms. Sebastus IV faded from the maps of imperial campaigns, but in the memories of both legions, it remained vivid. The Iron Cage was not just a fortress. It was the meeting of two ways of war, two legacies shaped by stone and steel, each determined to prove itself the greater. The battle ended with no clear claim of victory, but the cost paid by the Imperial Fists ensured that the Iron Warrior's purpose was fulfilled. In the quiet that followed, the fortress stood under the dim light of its world's sun. The guns were silent, the trenches empty, yet the shape of the battlefield told its story without need for words. It was the story of patience turned into a weapon, of pride meeting pride in a place where neither side could truly claim the ground. The iron cage closed long before the first shot was fired, and when it opened again, it left behind scars that would last far longer than the war itself.